Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for coming here. And it seems that I'm going to be the only speaker here who will really obey the rules.
No, I was about 11 minutes.
But I just have 3 slides, which I was told to do. And I'll try to keep it short, and for which purpose I will have to use my notes. Okay. So, I'd like to start with a question, and the question goes like this: what does contemporary art have in common with the drug policy known as harm reduction? Strangely, it seems that they have quite a lot in common. So I would suggest to look at the institutional background of the art scene in Ukraine as a kind of failed attempt to create a strategy of harm reduction for a society which was undergoing an extremely harsh and traumatic transformation to capitalism. So the discourse of contemporary art has arrived in Ukraine immediately after the Soviet collapse in the early 1990s. And it was tightly linked to the project of the overall neoliberal transformation of the former USSR. So contemporary art as a practice was firmly inscribed into the notion of so-called civil society or open society, which was advocated by the Western funding bodies. And the new art institutions were actually parts of larger networks that were also advocating things like the neoliberal economic reforms or the multiculturalist approach to diversity issues, or among many other things, the harm reduction in dealing with the epidemics of drugs use. So it seems that the very notion of harm reduction actually seems to be quite an accurate metaphor for the role of the arts in this new post-communist society. Because art as a social practice was needed in this reality to literally reduce harm imposed on this society by the advance of capitalism, which is actually in a way quite similar to the way in which harm reduction as the drug policy has totally overlooked the fact that the drug epidemics itself was caused in the first place by the same economic policies that this kind of open society and its institutions were imposing upon the underclass. So, what kind of harm was to be reduced by the means of art and its institutions? It seems that the so-called socially responsible art or even activist art practices were actually trying to fix one of the most tragic outcomes of the Soviet collapse, namely the atomization and disintegration of social ties and communities all over the country. So this became a real plague in the society that was suddenly overwhelmed by an ideology of radical individualism and social Darwinism. But the irony is that starting from the early 2000s, these new institutions of art themselves were forced to survive on their own in the world of market capitalism, since their funding by the so-called civil society institutions was withdrawn from them. So the project of art as harm reduction has ultimately failed. But this failure actually became the opportunity for politically engaged art. Its representatives started to pursue a project of recreating the social ties on their own, without the support of already existing institutions, and instead with the help of self-established networks and communities. So I was actually asked to give one example of an artistic intervention in the social field, and I would say that this example would be self-organization of a group of creative individuals into a collective. Okay, could be, doesn't matter. Certain kind of collective that would transgress the available models of institutions, organizations, or art groups. So in order to create social change, this kind of collective needs to be a hybrid one. It needs to evade the divide between the informal group and the formal institution. And it also has to balance between various disciplines to avoid the strict classification. And I will explain what I mean by using the example of the collective that I belong to, VCRC, or Visual Culture Research Center, that was founded in Kiev in 2008. So VCRC was created with an aim to produce an environment for the interaction between engaged knowledge, critical art, and grassroots politics. And I will briefly clarify each of these notions as we understand it. So the idea of engaged knowledge is based upon the practice of the humanities as a tool for social change, which is basically rooted in the tradition of Eastern European politically engaged intelligentsia. And the concept of critical art urges to abandon the autonomous field of artistic expression and to facilitate an active intrusion into the current social antagonisms. And grassroots politics, as we see it, is to reconstitute the social ties which had been erased or degraded by the dominant capitalist order. So one of the crucial elements here is the anti-fascist resistance to the hijacking of social dissent that the global powers are pursuing with the help of the far-right forces. Yeah, this should be the second slide, and this is basically, yeah, let's go back. Yeah, so the slides are basically the covers of the magazine, the publication that my collective is running. This strictly political component was always important for VCRC as a collective that would frequently stage street manifestations and protests in Kiev, while simultaneously organizing academic or para-academic seminars, art exhibitions, and running a magazine. This hybrid status of VCRC is also reflected on the structural level of the collective, which operates simultaneously as an informal group of friends or colleagues that share common interests, and as an institution responsible for running its own space and its own public program. But of course, this flexible and floating nature has often caused some serious troubles. For example, in 2012, VCRC was ousted from Kiev Mikhil Academy, where it was founded, on the grounds of apparently non-scientific activity, after the exhibition that we organized was censored and shut down by the university authority on the grounds of alleged obscenity and kind of breaking the moral codes of the society. And since then, the CRC is operating as a totally autonomous collective. We can go to the first slide. So, this was the first. So, why is this hybrid nature of the collective so important to us? First of all, it releases us from the trap of kind of obsessively trying to create a change or to provoke a change, and instead it makes it possible to perform the change or to be the change that we would like to create itself. And this is probably also the major artistic strategy that we borrow from the field of art and try to apply in the broader social field. For if it's true that if an everyday mode of being of an avant-garde artist should be indivisible from his or her work, then also you could say that the everyday mode of being of an institution could also be and should also be indivisible from the work of this institution itself. Thank you.